We have millions of different viruses living in every orifice, crack, blood, cell, everything in our body. In fact, it's very difficult to know what is viruses and what isn't. In other words, as he said, viruses are messages. They are the rapid response team. In other words, if you encounter danger, your body makes essentially it liberates or a piece of genetic material, which is what a virus is. It buds out through your cell membrane, which is what a virus is. It's called exosomes. This then goes to other cells and other tissues and sends them the message that we have been poisoned, we should do something. It's very similar in a way to what a tree does. If a tree in a forest gets eaten by beetles or something like that, then it sends out messages through its roots telling the other trees to make an immunological reaction against the beetles. This is how cells, how tissues, organisms, and even between species communicate with each other. In other words, I've been poisoned. Something bad happened. Usually a poison. The poison degrades your DNA. The DNA, the genetic material, is encased in this watery crystal. Something happens to disturb the watery crystal. It starts replicating a new piece of DNA or RNA and packages that up, sends it out as messengers that tell the other organisms there's something happening here. This is why it looks like it's contagious. You're sending a signal, a message to another organism that something happened here, you need to make an immunological reaction.
From the Weston A. Price Foundation, welcome to the Wise Traditions podcast for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
Hey, Hilda here. This is episode 235 and our guest is Dr. Tom Cowan. I'm not going to give a long introduction here because Tom is basically going to introduce himself. If this sounds unusual for a podcast, well, it is. This bonus episode is unlike many of our other episodes. In particular, this interview and the ideas Tom puts forth challenge some theories pertaining to contagion and viruses. But Tom makes crystal clear that he is not trying to tell us what to do or how to protect ourselves at this time. He simply wants to give us some information that is the result of much research on his part to help us better understand our current health crisis. We put this podcast out as a bonus episode because we at the Weston A. Price Foundation are not afraid to explore possibilities, theories that debunk or run counter to conventional ideas, and because we find the framework Tom presents intriguing and plausible. There is lots to consider with what Tom brings to the table today. He reviews a number of theories related to viruses and how they spread. Are they infectious? Or are they messengers? He reviews the esoteric and energy theories related to our health and relationship to one another. And he discusses many factors that are lowering our immune system function, including air pollution and non-native electromagnetic frequencies, particularly 5G. We invite you to listen to this conversation with an open mind and heart. You may want to do your own research on this topic after you're done listening. That's awesome. Tom offers a list of books and references for you to do just that. Oh, and a quick word to the wise. This episode is deep in case you didn't get that idea already. So hang on to your hats. Before we begin, just a word at the top, the Weston A. Price Foundation is here for you. On our website, we have numerous podcasts, articles, videos, and more. We are focused on food, farming, and the healing arts, and we need these more than ever, don't we? Just visit westonaprice.org to find these resources, and you can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Weston A. Price. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Tom.
Thank you, Hilda. It's good to talk to you again.
Well, with this virus situation, we wanted to get your perspective. So let's kick it off with the question about what is a virus exactly and what is their role in the body?
That's a good question, but I'm going to defer that question if you don't mind, because I have a few things I want to say first, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
So the first thing I want to say is obviously this is a controversial subject and a very sensitive subject. And I want to be absolutely clear that when I'm speaking today, I am speaking for myself, meaning Tom Cowan. I'm not speaking for any group. I'm not speaking for any, anti-vax group, pro-vax group, doesn't know about vax group. I'm not speaking for the Weston Price Foundation. I'm not speaking for anything to do with anthroposophy or anthroposophical medicine. I'm not speaking for holistic doctors. I am not speaking for anybody except myself. And I want to be very clear about that. If there's things you like or things you don't like, that's my responsibility, not anybody else's. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I am not a virologist. I'm not an immunologist. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not an immunologist. I've already said that. I'm a general practice medical doctor. I've been in practice since 1984. Almost every day in that last 36 years, I've thought about and studied and read about how the world is, and particularly in relation to health and medicine. That's out of what I'm speaking.
Those years of experience, and you want to bring your take on it. You don't want to speak for other people or other groups. I get the idea.
Right. The next thing I want to say is because of things that have happened, I'm now receiving, I don't even know how many, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 emails every day with questions. And I'm not prepared to be on my computer for 12 hours a day. And so I just want to say that because I don't typically, when I answer questions and talk, I don't put in citations and references. So I'm going to give everybody a bunch of references and books, and that all of the citations, all of the references that I'm referring to are in those books. And especially I'm talking to healthcare professionals or medical doctors now. If you have a question like, where did you get this study on polio virus? The answer to that is in a book called Virus Mania. It's written by a guy named Klaus Cowan. I think you can get it at Amazon. And all the references are in there. So I will not be responding with giving you references. Another book you should read is called The Silent Revolution in Cancer and AIDS Medicine. That was written by a German author named Heinrich Kremer. And in there are literally thousands of references to exactly what I'm going to be talking about. So my hope is that before you email me with references, you check those sources. Another book is called The Invisible Rainbow by Arthur Furstenberg, which is the history of electricity and human health. And again, in there, there's hundreds, if not more, references about that subject. So if anybody is interested in that subject, or when I say things about the Spanish flu, if we get into that in 1918, which some people have told me not to call the Spanish flu, but that's sort of what we call it. The references are in that book. Some of the references are also in my Cancer and the Biology of Water book. Other ones are in a book called Water Codes by a woman named Carly Newday. And some of the references, if we get to that about water, will be in there. So again, I don't mean to be rude or arrogant to people. I can also tell you that I've received hundreds of supportive emails from people, some of whom I haven't heard from in 30 plus years. And I read every email I get. And it's literally moved me to tears sometimes what I've heard from people. And so I'm not trying to be rude to people, but I cannot spend 12 hours a day citing references. I hope, and my expectation is people who are interested will follow up for themselves.
Absolutely. I think it would be antithetical, I guess, to your approach to living if you were to be in front of your computer answering every email. You and I have spoken before, and you've said on this show that it's important to get outside and to have balance. And so I can't imagine you having to go through that.
Right. And the final one is there's a website called theinfectiousmyth.com. And so a lot of the information about this current situation can be found there. And then again, I want to finally be clear that just because I reference these books and sites, some of these people I've actually talked to, and some of the people are helping me understand this. But this is in no way meant to say that anybody else is agreeing with or supporting what I'm saying here. This is me. And the next thing I'm going to say, and maybe this is sort of irrelevant, but again, I have been accused or suggested in my life that I can get rude or arrogant, and I would actually agree with that. We all have our things we have to work on. I've taken this as
maybe a word of warning?
It's a challenge. That's the word.
Okay.
It's a challenge to me to be as clear and, I don't know what else to say, as loving and honest as I can be. And that's all I can say. That's what I'm trying to do. If I come off any other way, that's not my intention. And I hear people's feedback and I'm working on this. And the final thing I'm going to say, I know there's a lot of disclaimers here, but I wrote a book. And so there's two more things. One is when we talk here, first of all, I am not privy to know what's going to happen now. I don't know how many people are going to die. I don't know how long this is going to last. I've never treated anybody in my practice with this situation. So I have things to say about what may be helpful, but I don't have any treatment or prescription. I'm not going to tell people to not go outside, to go outside, to not wash their hands, to wash their hands. That's not what I'm here to do. I'm here to explain how I see the world. Now, some people may be interested, some people may not be. All I can say to everybody out there is one of the qualities of the world that I want to live in is a world where people can say things. And some of them are correct and some of them are incorrect. And that's just life. And so all I'm doing is saying how I think and how I see the situation. And then again, with your indulgence, I'm just going to read one thing, which is a quote from the beginning of my heart book. And, as people who know me, they know I'm no stranger to controversial subjects, right? I mean, that's sort of Tom's middle name. And so in that book, I tried to demonstrate that the heart cannot possibly be a pump. And of course, everybody thinks it is, and I gave my reasons why it isn't. And one of the things I looked at in that was the quality of water. And I would submit that the human being who knows the most about water, probably ever, was a fellow named Victor Schauberger. And I put a quote from Schauberger in the front of this book, and I think it's probably even more appropriate right now. Quote, "People may say I am crazy. Perhaps they are right. In this case, it is not so much important if there is one fool more or less in the world. But in case that I am right and science is wrong, Lord have mercy on mankind." So with that, I will then try to answer your questions, although I think I'm going to try to frame this in a way that I think people can understand the best, and I'll just try to do my best to do that.
So much suspense has built to this point, Tom. So yes, let's just go for it. We understand that you're speaking for yourself and that some of what you may have to say may surprise and unsettle people or be controversial. As you know, the foundation is also not afraid of a little controversy. So go ahead and speak your mind, and we are open to your point of view. So let's go back to that very first question. Talk to us about what viruses are, what they do, and what their role is in the body.
Right. And I'm going to change that question a little bit because I think the best way to start, and again, I'm not trying to be rude or arrogant by changing your questions. I just think that I have a sense of how to present this, not that you don't, but present this in a way that people will be able to follow what I'm saying.
Excellent.
So the question really, we'll get into what is a virus later, but this is a multi-layered, complex story. In fact, I would say to try to understand this, and I would then say, I'm not a little bit sure I don't have a complete understanding of this. I am 100% sure I don't have a complete understanding of this. But here is what I do understand. That if we're confronted, we meaning the medical community or the human race or either of those, with a new set of symptoms, the question is, how do we know that this new set of symptoms is from an infectious disease? That's the first fundamental question. Now, I've heard from people, and it's interesting what I get from them, because some people will say, well, if a bunch of people have the same symptoms in one place at the same time, that proves it's an infection. But I would submit that that's actually not true, because, for instance, somewhere around 1945, they dropped a bomb on Hiroshima, and I think about 500,000 people died from the same symptoms, and that was clearly not an infection. Now, the similar thing, not as many people, but happened with Chernobyl. So they had this explosion, and then it started to spread across Europe. So people got sick, and some of them died, and you could see then a kind of spread of the disease. And all of us, I think, would agree that there was no evidence that that was an infection. In fact, they were being poisoned by radiation. So the argument that A, that it's spreading, or B, that a lot of people in one place get the same thing, is actually not a scientific proof of infection. Here's another example. People, how come 3 people in my house got sick? So one thing could be somebody put some, arsenic in your water, or somebody put some cyanide in your water, or there could be hundreds of different explanations of that. Now, I'm not saying right now that it wasn't an infection, and it's a sort of interesting thing one might want to examine. My point is, that's not proof of infection. So the question is, how do we prove that it's infection? Now, this question has been answered for, almost 100 years or maybe more. I'm not sure exactly when it started. They're basically called Koch's postulates. Now, I would say that these are sort of timeless postulates. They're just ideas on how this works. And so let me describe Koch's postulates. Koch's postulates means that if you have a set of symptoms, let's take an example. You have high fever, you have a rash, you have a stiff neck, you're sicker than you've ever been ever. And then if nothing is done, that you die in 2 or 3 days. So that's a classic symptom story for something called meningococcal meningitis, which is a kind of meningitis caused by a bacteria called meningococcus.
Yes, I've heard of that.
That's Koch's postulate number 1. Everybody has more or less the same symptoms. Any reasonable doctor can diagnose that based on the symptoms. Mm-hmm. So that's step 1. Step 2 is if you examine the blood of all those people with meningococcus. If you lined up 500 people with those symptoms, 100% of them will grow out the bacteria in their blood. Not 80%, not 30%, not 99%, 100%. And if they don't, that means they don't have meningococcus. That's postulate number 2. Postulate number 3 is no normal people walking around like you or me. Presumably you're fine. We don't have meningococcus growing in our blood. Never. And I mean 0% of the time. Because it turns out that having meningococcus growing in your blood is not compatible with walking around. I mean, maybe you could walk a step, but not much more than that. You are in big trouble. Number 4, so that's number 3. Number 4 is you can take that meningococcus you can purify it so that you only have a pure culture of meningococcus. You could inject that into another person, which you wouldn't want to do, or you can inject it into a susceptible animal, which the animal wouldn't want you to do. But so you do that, and they 100% will get sick, and they'll have the same symptoms. It may be different depending on the species a little bit, but more or less. And then you can grow the meningococcus out of their blood, and you can transfer that to another animal, and on and on. Mm-hmm. That's how we prove infectious etiology. Now, you can do that with a virus as well. So what is a virus? A virus is a piece of DNA or RNA, a few other proteins, and then it's encapsulated by a piece of your own cell. Now, we're going to get back into that a little bit later, but you could take a common viral disease like chickenpox and say, more or less, everybody with chickenpox has the same set of symptoms, right? Mm-hmm. Some people have 102, some people have 103 fever, but more or less they have the same. They feel crummy, not horrible crummy, but crummy enough. They get vesicular rash, which means they have oozing bubbles, and that lasts about 7 to 10 days, and then they get better. That's the situation. Now, 100% of those people will have literally millions of copies of the virus in their blood. They also have thousands, maybe millions of copies of viruses in their, vesicular fluid. Because a virus is, I think somebody said, a billionth of a centimeter. So we're talking, if there's 3 billion bacteria in a teaspoon of soil, there's hundreds of billion viruses in that same soil. So we're talking about millions, maybe more viruses. So then you can take those millions of viruses, you see them on an electron microscope. That's how we see them, because they're too small to be seen in a normal microscope. And then you can purify the culture, and that means you have only a culture of those viruses. You can then expose an animal, and they'll get symptoms just like chickenpox or whatever the equivalent of chickenpox is for a monkey or a rat. And then you'll have viruses from them, and you can expose the next animal, and then so on and so on. Is that clear? That's what Koch's postulates mean.
Yes, I think so. And so up until this time, that has been our definition of what a virus is?
No, that's a definition of how we prove infectivity.
Oh, okay.
That's how we prove that this set of symptoms was not from Chernobyl, not because of an apple fell on everybody's head in Georgia, or it was actually an infective agent.
Okay.
Now, I've had some criticism over the last few days saying, well, we don't use Koch's postulates anymore. They're out of date. And I'll get into that. Mm-hmm. But the fact is that's not true. In fact, there is a recent study about this current coronavirus situation that attempted to prove Koch's postulates right now. So it's not true that these are the principles for how we demonstrate infection as the cause.
Okay.
But I'll get into why we don't use Koch's postulates a little bit later.
Okay.
So let me then say, so what should have happened in this current outbreak? Which, as I will say, as far as I know, and if somebody has evidence that I'm wrong, I would love to see it. But as far as I know, this didn't happen. So let's say there was 500 people in somewhere, let's say in some city in China, that had a new set of symptoms. They should have called up the local virologist, the local CDC, whatever they call them, or if they didn't have that, or they're not as sophisticated or whatever, which I think they are, they call up the American CDC and say, we have 500 people with the exact same symptoms. We want to know what the cause is, right?
Yeah, that sounds really logical. It sounds like the thing they would do. Yeah.
The first trouble is what they're saying is the people actually don't have particularly characteristic symptoms. They have a low-grade fever and a dry cough. Now, the problem is lots of people have dry coughs and lots of people have low-grade fevers. They could have the flu, they could have a cold, they could have asthma, they could be exposed to air pollution. There's lots of things. So that set of symptoms, unlike meningococcus or chickenpox, doesn't really help. But then you would have taken these 500 people. Okay, we think this is a different kind of dry cough and low-grade fever. Let's take these 500 people and examine their blood and demonstrate that all of them have millions of copies of this new coronavirus in their blood or in their lung tissue. And again, as far as I know, not only didn't that happen with 500 people, not only didn't that happen with 100 people, not only didn't that happen with 10 people, I'm not sure it happened with anybody.
Oh.
Now, they took people's respiratory sputum, and they examined it under electron microscope, and I've seen the pictures, and you see all kinds of things, including a coronavirus. But you see other viruses, you see debris, you see proteins, you see, if you look at somebody's respiratory secretions, obviously there's going to be a lot in there.
Yeah.
And so what they saw was a coronavirus amongst everything else. They then essentially looked at that coronavirus under a microscope and said, this has a different genetic material than the usual one. The genetic material of a coronavirus is RNA, not DNA. And so we think this is a new virus. Okay, fair enough. They may have seen a new virus. In fact, they probably did see a new virus. But they didn't demonstrate that that new virus is in millions of copies in everybody. And then the next thing is, if I was the CDC investigator, I would have said, show me 500 normal people, approximately the same age and the same health status. So in other words, if you took 500 people who all had lung disease, that's not really the same. So you have to match them to the 500 people who are sick. And you would look in there and say, how many of them have an example of this coronavirus in their respiratory secretions or blood, right? Because it should be 0.
Yeah.
And as far as I know, not only was that not done with 500 controls, it was not done with 100 controls, it was not done with 10 controls, it wasn't done with anybody. So that's a problem, because how do you know? Now, the next thing is they did take that respiratory secretions, and I've read the original articles that came out postulating that this was a new infection with this coronavirus. Quote, they said, we did not attempt to purify the virus. So what does that mean? They took the respiratory secretions that had this new virus, coronavirus, but has, millions of other viruses maybe, or 10 others maybe, and a whole lot of toxic stuff. And they injected it down the throat of some animal or in the nose. And some of the animals got sick. Now, not all of the animals. And then, in fact, one study, they couldn't get normal mice sick, so-called wild mice. So they used genetically defective mice. And those are the mice that got sick when they injected them with this unpurified snot. Excuse my French. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like proof to me.
Tom, you know what this reminds me of? When you and I spoke before about heart disease and heart blockages, and you talked about how a young person, an apparently healthy young person, could be struck by a car and killed, and they would find that they would have just as many heart blockages as the person scheduled for some kind of bypass surgery the next day. In other words, we were making the same erroneous assumptions when it comes to the heart situation. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean, but let me give you another example, because this is not the first rodeo here. Let me give you another example. And again, please don't ask me for references. They are meticulously referenced in the book called Virus Mania. In the late 1800s, there was a new disease of paralysis of basically the limbs of particularly children, but sometimes other people. And again, nobody knew what it was. It happened to be the same time as they started spraying orchards with a chemical called lead arsenic. Now, then they did pathology examinations and autopsies on people who died and found out that there's a certain part of the nervous system called the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord, which are affected, which is what was essentially leading to the paralysis. It turns out that lead arsenic is a specific toxin for that part of the nervous system. But there were some people there who said, because this was the heyday of Pasteur and the whole germ theory, and they said, no, this must be an infection. So it was called polio. Now, they then tried to transmit the infection because they didn't have electron microscopes, I think, and again, I think it was in the 1930s that they invented the electron microscope. But I keep saying this, don't somebody send me a study and saying it was 1939, not 1935. I'm not sure the dates.
Okay.
But it was somewhere around then. They didn't have electron microscopes, so they couldn't see any transmissible agent. There was no bacteria. They couldn't find it with controls. In other words, normal people, they didn't see the bacteria. Polio people, they didn't see it. So they said, it must be something smaller than a bacteria, but they couldn't find it. So they said, well, the only thing we can do is try to transmit it to a healthy animal and see if they get sick. So that's what they did. So they basically ground up brains from people who died or the spinal cord of people who were paralyzed. And they essentially ground them up in a blender and had monkeys drink them. And none of them got sick. And then they said, okay, we'll inject it subcutaneously, like in the arm of a monkey. And nobody got sick. And they were determined, I've heard, I don't know if this is the exact number, but they used over 500,000 monkeys to try to prove this. Eventually then, somewhere around 1906, 1908, again, the reference is in the Virus Mania book, a researcher, or maybe it was two, they did an experiment to prove it. So they took two monkeys, they took the diseased spinal cord of a child who was paralyzed, they ground it up, they drilled holes in the monkey's skull, they injected about a quarter of a cup of this unpurified diseased spinal material into these two monkeys' brains. One died and the other became paralyzed. You can see a picture of the researcher holding up the paralyzed monkey. And that was the proof that polio was a transmissible disease.
Whoa, mind blown. Because all of us thought polio was infectious. I mean, they were giving the kids the sugar cubes with the polio medicine and in it and vaccinations to try to prevent polio, right? And yet you're saying we might have been looking at it the wrong way.
You know, as I sort of jokingly said, the message that I get from that story is if you're a monkey and somebody wants to drill a hole in your skull and inject a quarter cup of diseased spinal cord matter into your brain, your best bet is to run away. They then, the biggest outbreak of polio ever, because there's interestingly another poison that affects exactly that part of the brain, which is called the anterior horn cells of your nervous system, and that's called DDT. So they introduced DDT sometime in the 20s or 30s. And then there was an increase. And then the biggest outbreak ever was in Detroit. It happened to be where I was growing up in the late 50s. By this time, they could examine people. And of the people who got polio, 51% had evidence of a virus. The other 49% didn't. Again, you can find the references to this. So you could ask the question, what happened to the other 49% then? Obviously, the whole thing is well, it's a bit crazy. And this led then to a whole lot of other diseases having the same thing happen. We're talking Hep C, we're talking SARS, we're talking H5N1, we're talking Ebola, we're talking Zika, we're talking H1N1. In no case did they do this Koch's postulates, same symptoms, find the virus in millions of cases in a certain affected fluid, find it in nobody who's not sick, transfer it, prove infection.
In other words, many of us could be walking around with the same thing as the person with the coronavirus, the person that's been labeled with that infectious disease, when it's not been proven that it's infectious. Is that what you're saying?
It's not proven that it's the cause. That's the point. There is a very specific technique which all virologists, all epidemiologists, all infectious disease people either agree with, or at least they should agree with. But apparently, because of polio, and it sort of went like this, well, we know it's an infection and we can't find it, so we have one of two choices: either to acknowledge that we can't find it and we can't prove it, or to say the rules of engagement, i.e. those postulates, are wrong. So that's what they said. There's no evidence that they were wrong. It was essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy. We can't prove it's infection, therefore we're going to discard the way we prove it. And then it was off to the races. Now, let me get then to the next question. So obviously there's something happening now, right? And it may be even different. Some people say yes, some people say no. I don't know, but let's say it is. So the first thing I would say is I'm questioning whether even there's an infectious etiology, or whether it's this virus, or whether they've proven it.
Okay, so if it's not provable that it's infectious or a virus, what's the cause?
So here's why that's the wrong question. Imagine every morning I was running on a track in Lubbock, Texas, and the inside of the track was grass. And so I go there 8 a.m. every morning, run around the track. One morning I show up and a 5-story high boulder covering half the track is laying on the grass in the middle of the track. Uh-huh. And underneath the grass is perfectly normal. There's no grass, the grass is fine. There's no hole, there's no crater, there's no nothing. And then I go home and I think, man, that's weird. And I hear on the news that a meteor fell from the sky and landed on a football field in Lubbock, Texas, and that's why there's this boulder there. And I would say to myself, I don't think I believe that. Because if a meteor fell from the sky, I would think there would be a big hole there, or at least it wouldn't bother the grass. And so my first question would be, I'm not sure I believe that story. Now, it isn't really up to me at that point to say, well, Tom, how do you think it got there? I mean, I don't know. Maybe the fairies put it there. Maybe somebody came with a forklift and put it there. I don't know. I wasn't there. But I can tell you, I don't believe this story. And so people, I think, my suggestion is stay with the story, because there's another part to this story, which we then have to get into, because people are being told then that there's a test. All right, Tom, they didn't do Koch's postulate, but we have a test that proves it's from this coronavirus, right? Mm-hmm. That's what everybody says. Now, Hilda, I'm going to put you on the spot for a minute here. I hope you don't mind.
I don't mind.
I'm sure you've heard about the test, right?
Yeah, I've heard a lot about testing. Yeah.
Right. Do you know what the test is?
No one's gone into detail about that. They've just said it's not widely available.
Right. Or it's not that accurate or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the interesting thing. People say, yeah, but Tom, there's a test. And I say, well, what's the test? And they say, I don't know. I mean, I would think you would want to know what the test is. So right. Here's the test. It's called an RTPCR test. It's a surrogate test. Now, I don't expect most people to know what I mean by a surrogate test, so I'm going to explain it to you, if you don't mind. Okay?
Go ahead.
So here's a surrogate test. Let's say I want to know how many feet there are in Lubbock, Texas. I don't know why I'm picking on Lubbock, Texas. I like Lubbock, Texas. Don't call me and say you don't like Lubbock, Texas. Lubbock, Texas is fine. And I don't mean feet like inches. I mean feet at the end of your legs.
Okay.
Right? So obviously the way to find that out is to get everybody in Lubbock, Texas, gather them in the town square if they have one, and count the number of feet, right? Then you know, 3,226 feet. Mm-hmm. Then you want to know how many feet are in the next town. So you get everybody and you count their feet, 3,218. And you keep doing that. And every time you get 100% accurate reading of how many feet there are in the town. You with me?
Yeah, I'm with you.
Now, then you say to yourself, this is too tedious. I don't want to do this. I'm going to use a surrogate test, and that's going to tell me how many feet there are. So here's the surrogate test. A, everybody who has feet has shoes. B, everybody who has shoes has one pair of shoes. C, everybody has shoes, they have shoelaces. D, there's one shoe store in town that only sells shoelaces. So I'm going to make this easy for myself. I'm going to go to the shoe store, ask them how many shoelaces they sold this year, and that's going to tell me how many people have feet.
But there's so many erroneous presumptions in that.
Yes, it's as they say, nonsense. The reason is because some people may not have shoes, right? For in Africa, a lot of people don't have shoes. I've heard that there's women who have more than one pair of shoes. I have even shoes that don't have shoelaces, and they may have even bought them online. So how do you know that all the shoelaces came from that one store?
Right.
And then it's even worse if you never once counted the number of feet in the town. So then you would have no idea. And that's what's called a surrogate test. And that's what a PCR test is. It was invented by a guy named Kary Mullis. He was given a Nobel Prize in chemistry for inventing this test. What you do is you take a piece of either DNA or RNA. If it's RNA, you have to use an enzyme called reverse transcriptase. That's why the coronavirus is a RNA virus. So it's a RTPCR test. Mm-hmm. The RT stands for they turn the RNA into DNA, and they postulate if you have evidence of that DNA, then that tells you you have an infection with that organism. The problem is, if you never proved in the way I just described that you have an infection with that organism in the first place, you can't use a PCR test in order to show it. And in fact, Kary Mullis said, you cannot use this test to diagnose infectious disease. He was very clear on that, which is interesting because what are you supposed to use it for? I mean, that's its only use. So let me go back a little bit. So what do they do with this test? So they say, we found a new coronavirus. It's in some of the people who are sick. We don't know how many, what percentage. We don't know if it's in normal people. We don't purify it, but we can take that virus. We know what the RNA is. We can take a piece of that RNA, which is unique. We can turn it into DNA. And I realize I'm getting kind of wonky here, but people have to understand this. We can then amplify it through cycles. And what that means is if you have one piece of DNA or 10 or 100, it's not enough to see it with the color change. So you make one piece become 2, and 2 become 4, and 4 become 8. And after you do that 20, 30 times, you have 1 million copies of this original RNA. Now, that was the technique that he came up with that allowed him, if you knew that this was causing, this virus or this bacteria was causing the disease, you could then find a unique piece of it. You could then amplify it through these cycles, and then you could use the surrogate test. In other words, if you knew that everybody in a town has one pair of shoes and they all have shoelaces, yes, then you can count the shoelaces and make it easier. If you don't know the first thing, you can't do the second thing. So because they didn't do the first thing, they can't use a surrogate test. And because of that, there's no way to know how many are false positive or false negative. And that's why you get one test has 80% false positive, one test has 2%, one test we don't know. But here's what happens. If you amplify it 35 times, you don't find it because it's not enough. So you amplify it 37 times, and then you start to find it. And then you say, okay, we want to find it more. So we amplify it 40 times, and then we find it more, but then we start getting positives, a lot of them. And then interestingly, and I want everybody to hear this, if you amplify it 60 times, everybody is positive.
Oh, everybody.
Everybody. So you have to find the sweet spot. In other words, 37 is, you start to find it, 40 is too many, And so let's say you do the test and you set the number of cycles, which is what they do with the test. They set it at 39 cycles. And all tests, biological tests, have false positives and false negatives. So let's say you have a low number of false positives at 39 cycles of 1%. That means if you test 30 million people, you'll get 300,000 will be positive, and then you have an epidemic. And then if you want to demonstrate that because you gave them wheatgrass juice or a vaccine or told them to drop a book on their head or whatever you did, then there's no more positives. All you have to do is put the cycles down to 36, and then everybody tests negative.
So, Tom, I hope this isn't taking you off track, but why didn't they do that initial test? Why don't they test normal people to see if they have the coronavirus in them, and then they could determine that maybe that's not the cause of the situation that we're in?
You have to ask them, Hilda. I don't know. I am going to be very meticulous in not speaking for other people's motives.
Okay.
They decided we don't have to do this. To me, that was a monumental mistake in the history of medicine. That's just me. I would rather do it the way that makes the most sense, that makes it clear. In that case, as Carrie Mullis said over and over again, you cannot prove causation with a PCR test, period. He became, interestingly, and I don't want to get into this, a so-called AIDS dissenter because they never saw the virus with AIDS, et cetera, the whole story. They used a PCR test. They called it a viral load. He was furious. He said, you cannot use this test to prove viral causation. Is that going to get me 10 more thousand emails? I don't know. But read the book, The Silent Revolution in Cancer and AIDS Medicine, and you'll see the whole story. So that's the first problem. So having said that, now we can turn to what is a cause and what is a virus. Now, for this, I want to refer particularly health professionals and medical doctors to a lecture given by one of the most prominent virologists in the world named Skip Virgin. The lecture, you can see it on YouTube, was the 2014 NIH annual lecture on the state of virology. And I don't have the YouTube thing. You can find it. I found it myself.
Yeah.
So.
And we can put the link in the show notes so people can find it easily.
And by the way, I'm not saying that this Dr. Virgin agrees with me, but here's what he said. He said, look, people, we have millions of viruses in our so-called virome, which is the equivalent of the microbiome. Mm-hmm. Now, let me go back a little here. Back when I was in medical school, we knew nothing about a microbiome, meaning the bacteria that live in your gut and in your eyelid and your nose and everywhere else in your body. So we tried to sterilize people who were sick. We would give them lots of antibiotics, sometimes radiate them with x-rays to try to sterilize their bodies so that they would stop being sick. Of course, it never worked and they all died, but never mind. So now we have this theory that viruses come from the outside and they're, these wily attack things, and you don't have any normal viruses in you. Well, as he pointed out, 20% of our DNA at least is viruses. And we have millions of different viruses living in every orifice, crack, blood, cell, everything in our body. In fact, it's very difficult to know what is viruses and what isn't. In other words, as he said, viruses are messages. They are the rapid response team. In other words, if you encounter danger, your body makes essentially it liberates a piece of genetic material, which is what a virus is. Mm-hmm. It buds out through your cell membrane, which is what a virus is. It's called exosomes. This then goes to other cells and other tissues and sends them the message that we have been poisoned, we should do something. It's very similar in a way to what a tree does. If a tree in a forest gets eaten by beetles or something like that, then it sends out messages through its roots telling the other trees to make an immunological reaction against the beetles.
It's like our natural way to protect ourselves and to communicate.
Yeah, this is how cells, how tissues, organisms, and even between species communicate with each other. In other words, I've been poisoned, something bad happened. I'm going to communicate to the, or it could even be a quote infection, but we're going to flesh that out a little bit. Mm-hmm. Something happened, usually a poison. The poison degrades your DNA. By the way, the DNA is encased in crystalline water, like I described in my book.
Yeah.
I've irrefutable evidence of this. Please don't ask me for the reference. It will be in my next thing that I write about this. But the DNA, the genetic material is encased in this watery crystal. Something happens to disturb the watery crystal. It starts replicating a new piece of DNA or RNA, or the DNA becomes RNA, that's a more technical way to say it, and packages that up, sends it out as messengers that tell the other organisms there's something happening here. This is why it looks like it's contagious. You're sending a signal, a message to another organism that something happened here, you need to make an immunological reaction.
There's a threat present. First of all, my body, I guess, is defending itself, but then it's communicating, say, to my family, there's a threat present. We all need to do this.
Yes, exactly. That's why it's complicated. And as Dr. Virgin said at the end, they said, man, Skip, this is incredibly complicated. And he said, appropriately enough, I know, don't blame me. That's how life is. This is incredibly complicated. In other words, we have injury. We have packages of communication devices packaged in your own cells. And that's why these PCR tests, if you look hard enough, we do have that piece of RNA in there. In fact, I would even go so far as to say a woman named Barbara McClintock, and again, the references are in the Virus Mania book, she proved that even the DNA is flexible. So an injury happens, you can actually have, she didn't say the watery matrix, but I would say the crystalline water changes the DNA, makes a new genetic material, it gets packaged up, and that's what we call viruses, and that's what looks like contagion. Now, for those of you who say, oh, that can't be, just think about this. And here, Hilda, if you don't mind, I'm going to put you on the spot for a minute.
Go for it.
It's as if I'm talking to 1,000 people. Now, here's one model of viral infection that we have these, quote, wily viruses. Now, again, a virus is a piece of genetic material, either RNA or DNA, some proteins, and then a cell membrane from you. So, for the last 40 years, knowing the wily virus theory, I've often said to myself, I wonder which part of that is the wily part, right? Wily means they're thinking, I'm going to escape detection. So is that the piece of RNA, like it's thinking, I'm going to escape here? And anyways. So let's take, the theory is wily virus, you're just going around minding your own business. Virus attacks you, makes millions of copies of itself, and then you're sick, right? That's the theory. So here's 5 viral diseases. Chickenpox, measles, German measles, mumps, and hand, foot, and mouth disease, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Those are all classic viral diseases. So you've heard of all those, correct?
Yes.
Here's the next question. Have you ever seen a human being with any one of those diseases, personally?
You mean like the chickenpox? Yeah, I've seen it, yeah.
Like a lot, or 5 times, or 20 times. In other words, you've seen it.
I've seen it, yeah.
And tell me if I'm wrong, but your understanding is before 1950, for instance, there was millions of people who got chickenpox, measles, mumps, hand, foot, and mouth, and German measles, correct?
Yeah, that's what I've been told, that a lot of people had it until we came up with vaccines for it.
So everybody agrees with that, I think. Now, this would have been an easier question to ask somebody in 1940. So you may have to surmise a little bit. in other words, it's true that there's a lot of people who were, quote, attacked by this virus and then they got symptoms. Now, how many people do you know of who had all 5 of those at the same time?
Not a one.
Have you ever heard of anybody like that?
Nope. Mm-mm.
As far as I know, it's never happened or been reported. How many times have you seen people get 3 of those at the same time?
Never.
How many 2?
Nope.
Nope, never happens. As far as I know, it's never even been reported. Now, if this was simply a virus attacking you, why couldn't 2 viruses attack you at the same time? I would submit there's 2 possible explanations for that. One, there's something really wrong with that theory. Or 2, in the history of the last, say, 200 years or whatever, not once has a child or a human being been exposed to 2 viruses at the same time.
Oh, and that last one is very unlikely.
I would agree with that, Hilda. In fact, I would say that is frankly impossible. Everybody was exposed to chickenpox, measles, mumps. And then they say, well, but it attacks the same tissue. But there's still lots of cells that are unaffected. And then what about mumps? Mumps attacks your parotid gland. So why couldn't you have one virus attack your parotid gland and another attack your respiratory and another attack your skin?
Yeah, and if I were a wily virus, I'd go after someone that already had one kind.
Yeah, why not? In other words, the whole thing just doesn't make any sense. I don't know how else to say it. There's something else happening here. So let's go back to the virus is messenger theory. In other words, the people were poisoned. They send out a distress signal because we are a unified system. I would say we are a living, breathing, crystalline water being. And at any one time, it has one response, which is, I've been poisoned in this way. I'm going to send out the signal to my friends and relatives and everybody in the world, maybe, and that's going to alert them. You can't do 2 unified responses at the same time. It's just crazy. So you do one, then you get done with the one, and then you say, well, why does this happen to everybody, every child which got chickenpox? It could be, as many people have not only suggested, but actually, in a sense, proven, that there are certain sort of elimination phenomenons or this sort of messenger phenomena that all children have to go through in order to become healthy. It's part of the actual maturation process. So every child will be susceptible to, okay, here's the message. Okay, I'm going to do that too. It's a pretty harmless event. And then I'm going to have a physical antibody produced, which is the sort of physical marker that I've had that. I never get chickenpox again. And then I have less glioblastoma and less arthritis the rest of my life. That's why these diseases look very contagious. And that, I would submit, perfectly explains all the observable phenomena of essentially the history of viral diseases. And so that's layer 2. Layer 1 is virus infection, but they didn't prove it. Layer 2 is there's more happening here, virus as messenger. Now, some people then say, and I haven't spoken about this yet, and this gets even more esoteric, and all we're doing is saying, how does Tom see the world? I could be right and I could not be right. But here I go. So people say, yes, but it spreads all over the world. How can that be? Well, first of all, how can it be if it's a virus? Second of all, how could that be if it's a message? Which is really the same question.
Right.
Here we get into what is the nature of any physical substance. And, I think I've said to you before, if you say, so what is a virus? What is any molecule? A molecule is made out of atoms. What is an atom? Well, it's a nucleus that's here, and I'm putting my finger here. And then there's an electron over there in Oakland, which is way far away. And what's in between? Space, i.e. nothing. And then to make it even more complicated, the physicists say this stuff that we're made of, called atoms, like viruses are made of atoms, just like we are made of atoms. So not only is it 99.99% space, which then if you say, well, how come it looks solid? Nobody knows. How come a virus looks solid? Nobody knows. Nobody knows how anything looks solid. But then they tell us, mind-bogglingly enough, that some of the time it looks like a particle, which is 99% space, but the other time it's just a wave. It's not even any particle. And so it's just an energy form that then somehow crystallizes by some way we don't know into an atom, a particle, and then into stuff we call a rock or a human being. Now, if that's true, which is what the physicists say, and it's basically the picture of the holographic picture of the universe, then what happens is we have these energy forms which then presumably circulate all around the Earth. Now, I know that's going to be hard for people to swallow, but that's what the physicists basically tell us. It's like the 100th monkey phenomena. It's like proving that prayer in one place affects the outcome of physical events in another place. For those who want references for that, read Larry Dossey. So then the question is, what is this energy form that's circulating around the planet that's causing people to be sick? So that's a big question. So I'm going to stop there for a minute. And those are the three layers. There's more, but I'm not going to get into even more of how to understand what's happening at this time.
So let me ask you a clarifying question. You're saying that this is the explanation physicists have for us in terms of how this virus is spreading?
No.
Okay.
Physicist has said this is how the virus is spreading. They're saying this is the nature of reality.
Oh, that we're all connected.
We're all connected. We're all crystallized energy. That's the only way to say it.
Oh, okay.
We are crystallized energy, period. And so that makes things a lot more fluid and flexible than you have to spew out a messenger or you have to spew out a virus. I mean, in 1918, they couldn't even guess as to why people on a boat and people in South Africa and people in Chile all got it at the same time. They didn't have anything to do with each other.
Oh, that's so funny because I was just asking someone the other day, I said, how is it that the 1918 flu spread when, we were also spread out all over the world? And they said it was because the soldiers came home and brought it with them.
Yeah, that's nonsense. There's no evidence for that. And again, if you want to investigate that, read Arthur Furstenberg's book, The Invisible Rainbow.
Okay.
Now, I want to sort of finish by saying, so what I'm essentially saying is there is something that's poisoning us, that's causing DNA degradation, which is then being seen as this, quote, novel virus or new messenger that in itself is a kind of crystallized or physical manifestation of an energetic impulse. So the question then is, what is this toxic influence that's hurting us? Now, I will fully acknowledge that I can't know that right now. But here's what I can say. When you look at the places that are, so we know that the people have, an immunological, i.e. febrile reaction, they have a cough, and some of them are even having hemorrhages or bleeding in their lungs. And now they're even blaming heart attacks on this. In other words, what is happening to these people's lungs that's creating this new toxic insult? So you look at a place like Wuhan. So what do they have there? First of all, they have one of the most polluted with God knows what cities or places in the world. You can barely see the ground.
Wow.
Second of all, they hyper-vaccinated the people in the weeks and months before this. So in other words, they were shooting them full of metallic aluminum, which, by the way, causes an immunological reaction, a cytokine storm, so to speak, which is what they're saying is happening with this current epidemic, right? So you get a cytokine storm from the immunization, the injection of aluminum. There's aluminum in the air. There's all kind of other toxins in the air. There's the accentuation of the normal electromagnetic fields. And then, as far as we can tell, there's the introduction of a novel electromagnetic field called 5G. Now, let me stop there for a minute.
Yeah.
I have seen so many things. I've talked to some of the people in the world who seem to know the most about this. And everybody has a different take on how much 5G, whether it's 5G, et cetera. I don't know the answer to that. All I know is they say they rolled out these new energy forms. So what does this new energy form do? So here we have a situation of God knows what in their lungs, injecting them with substances whose goal is to produce an immunological cytokine reaction. And then they introduce a new electromagnetic field impulse into these people, which has very good evidence that it happens. One is these new electromagnetic fields interferes with the oxygen bioavailability. So in other words, even the oxygen in the entire planet has decreased by at least 1 or 2% in the last 100 years, which isn't good. And then you have an air polluted up the wazoo city, which is, by the way, exactly the same in northern Italy. And so the oxygen level goes down. And then you introduce an electromagnetic field, which further reduces the oxygen bioavailability, and then you get lung lesions.
Right. And these places, like, I understand where one of the first outbreaks happened in the United States in Kirkland, Washington, there was 5G at the nursing home or something like that. But what I hear you saying is that it's kind of a stacking of factors.
Yes, life is complicated and doesn't have to be the same factor everywhere. And some of it are messages from water, as they say. So here's another thing that the 5G or all electromagnetic fields do. I'm talking about non-native ones.
Right.
If you don't believe me, go to Furstenberg's book and you'll see the evidence. They degrade DNA and RNA. So in other words, they're causing degradation of your genetic material, which the body packages up as these novel messages. Number 3, they interfere with the distribution of calcium in and across the cell membrane. Now, I admit this one is controversial, and I've seen some evidence for it and some evidence against it. But the reason I think there's something to it is because if you introduce a new electromagnetic field and that causes the calcium to be pushed into the cell, you will end up with toxic cells, which is what you see, and lowered calcium in the blood. And the calcium is part of the coagulation pathway. In other words, if you lower the calcium in your blood, you will start bleeding, which is exactly what happened to the people in 1918. Most of the deaths were actually ascribed to hemorrhages. Now, I must admit, I put out a post on this a while ago, and I said that 1918 was a new electrification with radar, and that was a typo. I meant to say there was a new radio wave, and it was exactly those soldiers that you're talking about who were at the vanguard of using the new radio wave technology. And they suffered from hemorrhaging. Why? I don't exactly know, but I think they got a DNA damage, which shows up as a viral infection. They pushed the calcium into their cell. They had lowered ionized level of calcium in their blood. That causes failure of the coagulation pathways and bleeding. That is a perfectly acceptable explanation for every observable event then and now.
Right. And if what you're saying is true, and you've posited that it might not be accurate, but I'm putting all the pieces together, and it seems to me that we're living in fear of contagion right now, when maybe we should be paying more attention to the quality of the air that we're breathing and the water that we're drinking and the non-native electromagnetic frequencies that we're exposed to.
Right. And all that is absolutely correct, Hilda. And the other thing I would say is there have been a lot of very brilliant men, a lot brillianter than I by miles, who have tried to actually address this, I would admit, this esoteric third level. What is this energy form being put out when people are poisoned in this way? And they all come up with the same answer. It's fear and hatred. That is the energy form which is at the so-called spiritual root of contagion. Because we even know that it has physiological effects. If you frighten people, they get sicker easily. If you make them hate other people, they get sick easier. That is absolutely clear, and I don't think it's a coincidence, and I am not ascribing any motives or anything. I don't know how this happened. I don't want to speculate on where it's going or how it happened, but this rollout of fear has been one of the most intense experiences that any of us have ever seen in our lives. That's my sort of speech.
So are you saying that this fear and hatred are manifestations of the messages our bodies are sending, or are you saying that they make us more vulnerable to this kind of cellular detox exosome thing you were saying?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't think I really know the answer. I've heard a lot of different things. The way I conceive of this is that the damage is to the water. The water is the part that absorbs this electromagnetic fields. That I can easily prove, and don't ask me for the references. I will put them out in due time. It's the water that's the basis of life, and essentially what we're experiencing is a message from the water. If you keep poisoning me like this, if you keep degrading my ability to have us live happy, joyful lives, I have to put out a message that somehow then gets accentuated, that we need a different way of life, period. We need a different way of life. And if this is what it's going to take, that's what happens. Now, it's not as simple as that, which is why I go through the whole, there's viral theory, there's message theory, there's esoteric theory, there's energy theory. If you get into the physics of this, it starts looking very complicated. All I can say is we can't live the rest of our lives in this kind of state of fear and hatred. Whether
You're
it's
telling me
causing us to be the viral infection, that I'm not saying. Don't anybody accuse me of saying that. I think it's part of this process in a way which is so far beyond my ability to comprehend that all I can do is stand and say, this is not good for us. It is not good for us for everybody to be pushed in, isolated. Their only contact with life is through a screen. That is not the world that I want to live in.
And I feel like all of our energy forces on some level are feeling what you're expressing right now, Tom. And that's why we're open to the possibilities of exploring, understanding what's going on in our world today and of resolving this issue. So as we start to draw to a close, I want to ask you, if our bodies are indeed receiving this message that we're being poisoned and sending that message to other people on some level, it may be that any drugs or treatments we put out there may be of little use.
It may not, it may. Sometimes you can do things that, temporize the situation and help people live, and I'm all for that. I haven't treated anybody like this. I'm not telling people anything about what to do, except if you don't feel like things are going right, you should seek medical care as always. That's my only message. I'm not trying to undermine anybody. All I'm saying is this is how I see the world. I have no experience treating this, therefore I have nothing to say about treating it. I have a lot of things to say about the kind of world that I want to live in, the kind of water I want to see, the kind of, electromagnetic fields I want to live in. the kind of harmony I want to see between people, the kind of activities I think people should do, the kind of not putting stuff in the air, the kind of not putting glyphosate, which also degrades the DNA, in the water and in the biofuel. And by the way, in a previous interview, I said that there's glyphosate in biodiesel because biodiesel comes from corn, and I was told that biodiesel doesn't come from corn, so I was mistaken about that. I'm not sure where biodiesel comes from, but I know they use corn for fuel. I think it's called bioethanol or something like that.
Yeah, ethanol.
Anyways, so I have clearly made those kind of mistakes, and I wish I didn't, but that's not my field. You know, I'm not an EMF specialist or a biodiesel specialist.
So, Tom, given all the caveats and your explanation that you only have expertise in a certain field, what is driving you to get this message out?
That's a great question. I think some people would say insanity. So I'm going to risk being a little arrogant here, Hilda, if you don't mind. Okay, is that?
I don't mind. I don't mind.
I have a sense of myself that I needed to say something in my life. And when I was when I was a young child, I had such a bad speech impediment that I couldn't talk. And eventually my parents took me to a child psychiatrist. And I actually knew the guy later. I played tennis with him. And he said, "Don't worry about Tom. Someday he'll have something to say." And they didn't put me in therapy. They didn't do anything. They just left me alone. And it was around that time that I started thinking about how the world is organized. And so, sorry.
No, it's fine.
Over time, it has felt like I've been given sort of insights, or I don't know what they are exactly, and things that I should at least try to communicate to other people. I never know if they're right. I only can think about what I think and how I see the world. And some people have said I have an interesting ability to communicate certain things. So I have a feeling that it's as if I can't really live unless I say what I feel and say how I see the world. I don't know why that is, and I could be wrong. I could be deluded. I could be a lot of things. There's a lot of madmen out there. Schauberger was called a madman, and that's why I read his thing. Maybe I'm a madman. I think I'm going to finish with so one of the things I would like people to do right now, if they feel so inclined, there's a beautiful song that I love called "Hallelujah" by Leonard Cohen. I'm sure most people know that song.
Yes.
And you can find it on YouTube, sung by the children of New York City Public School, it's just the most amazing thing to see, because that's the world that I want to live in. Of fat children, thin children, black children, Hispanic children, white children, children with glasses, children with funny hair, children with no hair, who come together to sing, "Hallelujah, we're alive." And in there, if you go to this second part where this amazing little boy speaks, he sings, the second verse, he says, I did my best, and it wasn't much. And I told the truth. And I don't know how much of this is the truth. I'm trying my best. And that's all I can say. I hope people go out and sing that song. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom.
All right.
We appreciate the truth you've brought and the heart behind it.
Okay, thank you.
Our guest today was Dr. Tom Cowan. Find his website, fourfoldhealing.com, for more information. You can find me at Holistic Hilda on Instagram or Twitter, and on my website, holistichilda.com. For the show notes for this and every episode of the Wise Traditions podcast, go to our website, westinaprice.org, and click on the podcast page. And that's it. Thank you so much for listening. Stay well, my friend. Until next time.
On behalf of the Weston A. Price Foundation, thanks for listening. We have many free resources to support you on your health journey. Visit westonaprice.org to find podcasts, articles, videos, and more. You can also find a local chapter near you for help in finding sources of great food. We invite you to support the Foundation's mission of education, research, and activism by becoming a member. Thanks again, and take care. Wise Traditions is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. The content on this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or other healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice.